All right, let's just dive right into this one. We've all heard standard ghost stories, right? A lone person walking down a creepy, dark hallway, maybe seeing a shadow they just can't quite explain. And honestly, it is so easy to brush those off as just folklore or an overactive imagination. But this explainer, it isn't about folklore. We're looking at a mystery that completely defies all logic, and it stems from a very real, deeply tragic event in aviation history. So, buckle up, because the reality of this story goes way, way beyond your typical campfire tale.
Now, what is absolutely wild here is the sheer scale of the phenomenon. I mean, think about it. In almost every paranormal account, you've got a single, arguably unreliable witness, right? But what happens when an entire cabin, and we're talking more than 100 people simultaneously, experiences the exact same impossible event? They didn't just see something out of the corner of their eye, they heard it, and they actually interacted with it. To really understand how this unprecedented event happened, well, we have to go back to where the nightmare actually began.
Section 1. The Tragic Origins. 1972, New York to Florida. So, the year was 1972. Flight 401 was making what should have been a totally routine journey from New York down to Florida, commanded by Captains Albert and Robert. Everything was going exactly to plan. But, as we know with aviation, the absolute smallest anomaly can trigger a total catastrophe. As they were prepping to land, the pilots suspected they had a faulty landing gear. Naturally, fearing it might collapse under the pressure, they radioed ground control, who told them to hold their altitude and just engage the autopilot while they sorted it out. But right here is where fate took a really cruel turn. While they were distracted trying to fix the gear, a pilot's hand accidentally bumped the autopilot lever. It silently disengaged. No alarms, no flashing lights, and the plane just began a rapid, completely unnoticed descent right into the ground. The grim reality of that one tiny mistake is just staggering. To put the numbers in perspective, out of 163 passengers on board, only 75 survived. Of the 10 flight attendants, 8 made it out. But up in the cockpit, where the impact was obviously the most severe, neither of the pilots survived. To this day, it remains one of the most terrifying accidents in aviation history. It's a really stark reminder of how a split-second distraction can cost so many lives. But here's the thing. Surprisingly, the story of Flight 401 doesn't actually end in the wreckage. Section 2. The Salvaged Parts. A corporate decision. As time passed and the initial shock kind of faded, the airline realized something. Several highly expensive components from the wreckage were actually in perfect working order. This created a pretty jarring contrast. On one hand, you have corporate efficiency, right? I mean, it makes total financial sense to take functional scrap materials and install them right into new planes. Why waste perfectly good parts? But on the other hand, you have the utterly unexplained phenomena that followed. The aircraft that received the largest share of these salvaged parts was designated Flight 318. And let me tell you, almost immediately after it took to the skies, things started getting incredibly weird.
These eerie occurrences started trickling in, kind of quietly at first. For instance, an air hostess just walking through an empty section of the cabin literally saw a pilot sitting in a passenger seat giving her orders. Completely confused as to why a pilot wasn't up front in the cockpit, she went to check, only to find the actual flying crew securely in their seats. When she walked back, the figure was completely gone, and passengers and colleagues actually reported seeing her talking to thin air. But soon, it wasn't just her. Multiple other hostesses started confirming sightings of a strange man in a pilot's uniform who would just appear and then vanish into thin air. For a while, crews straight up refused to work on this plane, but the real breaking point? That was still to come.
Section 3. The Climax on Flight 318. An Overbooked Journey.
Okay, picture this. It's the peak summer holiday season. The flight is packed to the absolute brim, and the crew is under immense pressure. Among them was air hostess Faye Merriweather, and she was tasked with prepping meals for 180 people in just 2 hours. Imagine the scene. The cabin is super quiet. The lights are dimmed down low as passengers rest. Faye steps into the isolated, dim galley and reaches out to open the oven. But right before she can touch the handle, she just freezes. Staring back at her, reflected perfectly clearly in the dark glass of the oven door, is the face of a man. And he isn't standing behind her. The face is literally inside the reflection, and his lips are moving.
And he is repeating this chilling phrase just over and over again. Careful, this flight could catch fire. Faye was completely frozen. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she was absolutely paralyzed just watching this entity relay this horrifying warning right from the oven glass. Once she finally snapped out of her shock, she bolted to find the flight engineer.
Now, usually, people would scoff at claims like this, right? Like, oh, you're just stressed, seeing things.
But when the flight engineer rushed back to the galley with her, he stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't just see the reflection, he recognized the man instantly. It was Don Repo, the flight engineer who had tragically died in the crash of Flight 401. This wasn't some random, faceless ghost. This was his deceased colleague actively trying to communicate with him.
And this right here is where the mystery just deepens completely. Because this wasn't just in Faye's head, it wasn't just the engineer. As the warning grew louder, other colleagues, flight attendants, and even passengers who stepped near the galley area actually heard the entity shouting. An entire crowd of people visually and audibly witnessed a dead man desperately warning them that their plane was going to catch fire. It is literally unprecedented.
Section 4. The prophecy fulfilled. Mid-air terror.
Look, you simply cannot ignore a mass warning like that. Taking Don Repo's spectral advice extremely seriously, the crew got the plane on the ground safely, and it underwent a massive, deep inspection. Mechanics literally tore it apart, but found absolutely nothing wrong, so they cleared it for immediate service. But on its very next takeoff, right in midair, the plane suffered a sudden, catastrophic engine failure. Instinctively, the pilots wanted to force the engine to restart, which is standard procedure. But then, they remembered Don Repo's warning. Realizing that forcing the engine would likely ignite it and cause a massive fire, they backed off, adjusted, and managed to land safely. Think about that. A deceased flight engineer had literally just saved everyone on board.
Section 5. Cleansing the fleet. The exorcism.
So what exactly do you do when dead crew members start saving your flights but completely terrifying your staff? Well, the airline's solution was twofold. They addressed both the physical and the spiritual. First, they issued a historic aviation directive, the immediate removal of all salvaged spare parts from Flight 401 across their entire fleet. Get them out. But for Flight 318, they went a whole step further. A highly religious crew member stepped up and, with the full backing of his terrified colleagues, used holy water to perform a literal exorcism on the aircraft. And believe it or not, after the parts were removed and the exorcism was officially complete, the hauntings just stopped. They ceased entirely. No more phantom pilots, no more desperate warnings from the Evanglass. But that does leave us with one incredibly unsettling question, doesn't it? Are those parts still out there? According to numerous reports and some deep aviation folklore, while the airline absolutely ordered them removed, rumor has it that some of those durable, perfectly functional scrap pieces from Flight 401 were eventually recirculated or sold off, meaning they might still be sitting in the machinery of modern aircraft today. So, here is your final takeaway from this explainer. Aviation is an industry built purely on logic, on rigid engineering and strict rules. But sometimes the human element, even after death, somehow finds a way to intervene. So the next time you're cruising at 30,000 feet and you feel a sudden, unexplained chill sweep through the cabin, just ask yourself, is it just the air conditioning kicking in? Or could you be sitting right next to a salvaged piece of history, sharing your flight with the lingering spirit of Flight 401? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking questions.